So I think I hear some skepticism there, Jeff, from you. And if your skepticism of how it'll change some of that behavior anyway, is the reason for that skepticism because funders will still privilege R1 institutions over, say, the R2s and this new RCU designation? Like, if I'm a funder, why not fund the best institution to do the research? Or is it the case that, as Mushtaq told us, you might say, well, to be an R1, you don't need breadth anymore. So you might instead, if you're a funder, say like, well, where does, which institution does this particular research the best? And the answer to that specific question might not be at an R1 institution. So funding might follow.
Yeah, of course, we're talking about this in a vacuum in the first half of 2025 when we really don't know what the state of university research is going to look like given DOGE. But let's assume here that not much changes, which I understand for some of our listeners. They'll say, oh, wow, that's a big assumption.
Big and scary assumption.
Big and scary assumption, right? So that said, research is often a function of underlying resources and talent. The reason institutions wanted to become R1s is not in all cases because they wanted necessarily that breadth and depth of doctoral programs, for example, but it kind of gave them cachet to attract talent that would then attract money. Because of how we train faculty and researchers in particular, they're attracted to work at places that look like where they were trained. And many of them are trained at R1 institutions. So they would go and teach at institutions that weren't R1, and they said, we want to become R1, right? They wanted to replicate that experience of graduate education. So my fear is that this becomes a little like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? And everyone continues to behave the way they always have. Now, I hope I'm wrong, of course, but as you know, it's really hard to change human behavior unless there's a huge, and I mean huge incentive pulling people in a different direction. Now, what could that be in higher ed? Well, let's go back to Jerry Maguire. It's show me the money, right? When the money from the funders, whether that's a state, the feds, foundation, philanthropy, when it really does start to flow to different types of institutions, Michael, that's when I will be convinced. And there is a little evidence, and I say a little, that this can work. So I wrote about this about 10 years ago from the state of Tennessee. And it was actually a byproduct of a law there that changed how the state paid for its public colleges. Instead of basing appropriations on enrollment, like most states do, Tennessee tied all appropriations, taxpayer dollars, to institutional outcomes, things like credit completion and graduation rates, et cetera. Because the formula changed on the basis of an institution's Carnegie classification. So there was a formula for, this type of Carnegie classification, a formula for that type of Carnegie classification. It really punished colleges that moved too fast up the academic ladder, and then they didn't perform well at that level. So indeed, there was a strong financial incentive for universities to focus on improving what they already did rather than try to stretch upward, right? So there was that financial tie that I'm talking about to this. So the lesson, I think, Michael, is that the money really does need to flow in the direction of the new classifications for them to ultimately, in my opinion, change behavior.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jeff. Incentives matter. I think you're spot on. The reason prestige has been defined as, broadly speaking, looking like Harvard is because, as Deep Throat might have said back in the day, that's where the money is, right? So nonprofits, it turns out, do respond to those incentives as well. But is it fair on my part to assume that you're excited about, at least these institutions, they're going to continue to chase R1 status, but at least they no longer have to stand up PhD programs of little value or demand just to get breadth. But, and frankly, the downstream impact of that is adding to the roster of graduates of PhD programs who might not get cushy faculty jobs, or, at least we won't be adding programs at schools that are perpetually under enrolled because there's not demand, or adding costs to institutions that aren't necessary and might even come at the expense of student success, which we'll get to. Or, hey, at least if they're chasing R1 status, we're not going to have a program to train physical therapists that is a PhD program, and we can actually say it's professional and they won't get dinged for that in the future. That was my laundry list. I'll let you actually answer the question now, but at least if you're chasing R1, these negative incentives, I think, are pulled back.
Yeah, I mean, you still could get research status in many ways, but still is a R1, R2 research type of university. There still seems to be a hierarchy here. I kind of wish they had done away with the numbers instead, right? Because as Mushtaq said, right, people understand what the number one means, right? And we still have that number one. So there's still going to be, I think, a hierarchy here in terms of R1 status, even though it changed, right? The requirements for it, and there's other ways to become a quote unquote research university. I'm still skeptical.
But the R1 status, just to stay on this for one moment, Jeff, the R1 status, if I chase it, at least it won't have all these negative impacts, right? I think on a university that just shouldn't be having, dozens and dozens of programs with PhDs that it can't really support. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And again, I think the proof will be in the pudding, as they say, right? We'll see. We'll see.
Okay. So